David Darlington and his investigation of a military research installation in southern Nevada known as Area 51.
You know, anyone could say that about who's in any classified program.
Now, a look at the life and work of Irish poet William Butler Yeats. R.F. Foster discusses his biography of the poet called W.B. Yeats, A Life. The first volume of the work is subtitled The Apprentice Mage, 1865 to 1914. In the book, Mr. Foster looks at Yeats' poetry and also his careers as journalist, playwright, and political figure. R.F. Foster has written several books of history and biography. He spoke at the 92nd Street Y in New York City.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Carl Kirchway, director of the 92nd Street Y's Unterberg Poetry Center, and I'd like to welcome you to the third in this year's series of Biographers and Brunch lectures. This morning, distinguished Irish historian Roy Foster will speak to us about the life and work of William Butler Yeats. I also wanted to remind you that on Sunday morning, January 25th at 11 o'clock, here in the Art Gallery, English poet and critic Andrew Motion will speak about his new life of John Keats. I hope you'll attend. For those of you joining us for the first time this morning, I might say a word about format. Mr. Foster will speak about Yeats's life and work for about 50 minutes, after which he will respond to 10 or 15 minutes of questions from the audience. Following this, we invite you to partake of a light brunch, which will be served in the so-called Hall of Mirrors just outside. There, too, you will find copies of Mr. Foster's Yeats biography on sale. I should add that C-SPAN is here this morning taping this lecture for their About Books program, and we welcome them. Roy Foster refers to that collection of writings comprising Yeats's autobiographies as a disingenuous masterpiece. And indeed, I think there have been few documents in the history of modern poetry which are more fascinating or less reliable. In an installment of those autobiographies called The Trembling of the Veil, which refers to a period in the poet's life covered by the first volume of Mr. Foster's biography, we find the following passage by Yeats, quote, "When we are dead, according to my belief, we live our lives backward for a certain number of years, treading the paths that we have trodden, growing young again, even childish again, until some attain an innocence that is no mere accident of nature, but the human intellect's crowning achievement. It was at Cool that the first few simple thoughts that now, grown complex through their contact with other thoughts, explain the world, came to me," unquote. Poor old Yeats, still simplifying, as W.H. Auden ironically remarks in James Merrill's epic poem based on conversations at a Ouija board. Mr. Foster observes that the autobiographies are devoted to asserting personality through gesture and identifying development by strictly defined epiphanies. We may smile at the philosophy and mysticism behind that quotation of Yeats, but there is something haunting about it too. What is more, it is a perfect capsule description of the achievement of Roy Foster's ongoing biography, truly epic in scope, of which the first of 2 volumes, The Apprentice Mage, appeared this year. For what Mr. Foster does is to walk us back to the beginning of that chameleon artist's life. We see Yeats as Ernest Rhys did around 1887, quote, "a very pale, exceedingly thin young man with a raven lock over his forehead, his face so narrow that there was hardly room in it for his luminous black eyes," unquote. Through Mr. Foster's biography, we understand not only the old miracle that a supreme artistic genius should have emerged from the muddle of Yeats's unstable childhood and early family life, but also the difficulty of fixing that life in any reliable interpretive way, once it had come to consciousness, or perhaps we should say self-consciousness. For as Mr. Foster remarks, one of Yeats's gifts was an uncanny ability to predict posterity's reaction to him. For a man of masks, this deepened the play of writing his own history. But for a historian and biographer, it makes establishing the truth of that history surpassingly difficult. The great contribution of Mr. Foster's biography is that it does fix that life and the work that life produced, as no other biography has quite done, between and among the historical events to which that life aspired. And it does this by presenting the facts, but not necessarily by imposing the biographer's opinion upon them. An epic of service to the subject, Seamus Heaney called this biography in a recent review, a mighty argosy of scholarship. When I was an undergraduate in the late 1970s, beginning the study of Yeats, the triad of authors to which I was directed was Helen Vendler, Thomas Whitaker, and Harold Bloom. Critics, all of them. But why not biographers? One might have added Joseph Hone, or Norman Jeffers, or Richard Ellman. One might even have added Dennis Donahue, who has also spoken about Yeats in this Biographers and Brunch series. But from this moment, whomever else one reads for clarification of the life and work of this poet, one will be obliged to read Roy Foster first. It is an honor to welcome him here now.
Thank you very much, Carl, for those generous words. And thank you all for coming here on a fine Sunday morning to hear a historian, not a critic, not a poet, alas, talk about Yeats. I think I have a certain excuse for this, for being a historian writing and talking about this poet, and a certain sanction as well that comes from my subject. In old age, Yeats went to visit the Municipal Gallery in Dublin and was overcome to see there the portraits of the friends of his youth, all of them by now dead, Lady Gregory, Synge, and company. And he wrote a poem about it which ends with a celebrated Yeatsian instruction. And Yeats's poetry is full of instructions, some of which should be taken very seriously. You that would judge me, do not judge alone this book or that. Come to this hallowed place, where my friends' portraits hang, and look thereon. Ireland's history in their lineaments trace. Think where man's glory most begins and ends, and say, my glory was, I had such friends. Now, it's that last couplet that gets quoted most, and I think it's rather a pity, because I think it's uncharacteristically trite and characteristically disingenuous. Yeats knew perfectly well his glory came from other sources than the people who were his friends. But the line before it fascinates me. Ireland's history in their lineaments trace. Yeats knew that national history in Ireland, perhaps more than anywhere, is traced through individuals, through emblematic figures, and he knew he was one such. And I want really to talk today about Yeats in history, Yeats as emblem, Yeats as witness and actor in the drama of Irish history, because he lives all these lives. He lives the life of journalist, politician, revolutionary, theatre director, polemicist, as well as writing poems. And his public status in Ireland became iconic, especially after the 1916 Rising and the subsequent revolution against British rule, into which Yeats reinserted himself after a period when he had in fact become, as I think, disillusioned with Irish nationalism. However, he became the national poet with independence in the 1920s. He became a big, smiling public man, as he put it, and a senator in the Free State and all of that. But he never relinquished a combative relationship with Irish history, with Irish life, with Irish politics, what he called in one of his great essays, a continual quarrel and a continual apology. And controversy is all about him through his life. He ends his life as a great but controversial public figure. Smiling public man is only half of it. Perhaps because of this, the project of an authorized biography took a long time to come about and went through many vicissitudes, and perhaps because of this too, the Yeats family were determined quite early on to choose a historian to write it. So there, if you like, are my credentials. But Yeats isn't the only poet who sanctions this approach to his life. T.S. Eliot famously said that you couldn't understand Yeats without understanding his times. and you couldn't understand his times without understanding Yeats. It's fascinating, I think, to remember that Yeats, whom we think of in such a modernist framework, began as a Victorian, a late Victorian. He's a revolutionary in more ways than one, because he's the Irish Victorian who becomes the Irish modernist. He makes his name in the late 80s and 90s with Celtic twilight, dim blue and silver effects, and a certain decadent flavour which makes him controversial in Ireland. It's fascinating to think that he not only is operating at the same time as Aubrey Beardsley, William Morris, the whole circle of 90-ish people, but he knows them. He is always drawn to dramatic people. He has an almost supernatural affinity for finding and knowing the people who will themselves emblematize the history of their day. He's forever throwing off terrific theatrical effects in his poetry, as you know. In that, of course, I think he's very unlike Eliot, the other, I think, great figure of poetry in English in that era. I was thinking of, was it Virginia Woolf who said that, referring to some forthcoming social event, Tom Eliot will be there in a four-piece suit. And that idea of being buttoned up completely is terribly unlike Yeats, who is floppy ties and expansive gestures and the life lived as art. And lived theatrically. His life is full of scene changes, drama, announcements, personal statements. And the poetry, which often seems deceptively autobiographical, often carries a charge that isn't immediately apparent. I think this is true from the very early poetry, and to look at his first poems, the poems that made his reputation, the poems that made Irish history, culture, Celtic imagery fashionable, that made it accessible to an English and indeed an international market. One could look perhaps at a perfect little poem, The Song of Wandering Angus. I went out to the hazel wood because a fire was in my head, and cut and peeled a hazel wand and hooked a berry to a thread. And when white moths were on the wing and moth-like stars were flickering out, I dropped the berry in a stream and caught a little silver trout. When I had laid it on the floor, I went to blow the fire aflame, but something rustled on the floor and someone called me by my name. It had become a glimmering girl with apple blossom in her hair, who called me by my name and ran and faded through the brightening air. Though I am old with wandering through hollow lands and hilly lands, I will find out where she has gone and take her lips and kiss her hands and walk among long dappled grass and pluck till time and times are done, the silver apples of the moon, the golden apples of the sun. Which, when you know that apple blossom is his code for Maud Gonne, which when you see it as a poem about the Irish god of love, Angus, seems a love poem on a rarefied level. However, it could also be seen oddly as a political poem, because it's following a Gaelic genre of poetry called ashling poetry, which is about Ireland appearing as a visionary woman to a poet who represents the country in thrall, and the woman offers liberation. These are Jacobite poems, really, from the 18th century. And I think Yeats is consciously using that political form of Gaelic poetry to fuse it with, in this case, a love poem and a poem about mysticism. He's always at his most deceptive when he's at his most simple, and the longer I've worked on him, the more I admire those early poems. Even a little poem of quatrains like The Fiddler of Dooney, which seems almost insubstantial. When I play on my fiddle in Dooney, folk dance like a wave of the sea. My cousin is priest in Kilvarnet, my brother in Mocharabuie. I passed by my brother and cousin. They read in their books of prayer. I read in my book of songs I bought at the Sligo Fair. The place names are manipulated, the lovely dance rhythm is there, but it's also slightly exotic, and the poem goes on to argue that the good are always the merry, save by an evil chance. I love that qualification. And to argue that merriment and poetry and art are, or should be, prioritized over religion. When he enters heaven, the fiddler enters heaven before his priestly relatives. It's very much a an accessible way of saying what Yeats was saying in his essays at exactly this time, in the 80s, early 90s, that the poet must become the priest of a new cultural revolution, in a sense. So there's a depth to this deceptive little poem, too. And it's interesting to notice that this is the kind of poetry which he doesn't expel from his canon, as he expels so much of his early poetry, ruthlessly, takes it out of the published collections, rewrites it if it's to stay there, continually reassesses his canon. But The Fiddler of Dooney stays, and it's put as the signature poem at the end of a key collection. And he's still, in fact, reciting it in archival recordings of the BBC in the late 1930s. So it shows that I think he knows that it was central to his oeuvre. And those early poems, which he kept in his canon, have a clue, I think, to his development. Because he becomes tired of more predictable Celtic twilight effects from the turn of the century. He's looking for a harder, cleaner, newer note. He's experimenting with the strangely conversational idiom he brings into his poems. The deliberate modernity which Ezra Pound used to claim that he had helped to sculpt into Yeats's poetry, but which I think Yeats was moving towards before Pound began working with him, as he did work with him on the drafts of some of his poems. And the influence of this kind of diction is one of the things that qualifies him, I suppose, as a modernist. He goes on to help the young James Joyce to collaborate further with Pound, to write poetry, I think, of astonishing grandeur and mystery. Finally, in the 30s, though, he returns to those simple forms and the ballad meters and the strange shock effects of his late poetry can be linked back, I think, to some of his earliest experiments. Certainly, the strangely jagged, sensual, discordant note seems new, but I don't think it's entirely new. Now, if you compare this, that's a rather jejune and hurried run through the great development of Yeats's poetry, but if you compare this to Eliot's consistent, rather austere development and avoidance of drama, it's, again, I think, instructive. Another way in which they're different is the question of public life, because Yeats, I think, is unlike any other poet in the English language, except possibly Milton, who lives a violently engaged public life. It's always an Irish identification, though he spends part of the year always in London, and indeed in the first half of his life, which I've now published about, he really lives in England more than in Ireland, which came as rather a surprise to me, at least, so I hope as a surprise to others as well. But it's worth plotting this Irish life against the history of his times. He's born in the mid-1860s, just when the class from which he comes, the Protestant so-called ascendancy, is entering decline. It's losing its privileged hold on the reins of power economically, socially, and politically. And as so often, and I think Russian history will show us this too, a revolutionary will come from the ranks of a declining elite. But they are that ascendancy Protestant class, though not the possessors of big houses and hunters and family portraits and all that. They're from a couche sociale which provides civil servants, clerics, the sort of middle-ranking echelons of the ascendancy. And Yeats's father, dramatically, in family mode, turns his back on this, embarks on the life of a portrait painter, lives in London's artistic bohemia. Very poor. They're the sort of people who, when people come to tea in the afternoons, they have to borrow money from them and send one of the kids out the back to buy the tea and sugar for. This is an actual incident recorded in one of Yeats's sister's diaries. The father is, I think, a fine painter, but he can never finish a painting. His son learns by his mistakes, and I think it's very interesting that dramatic closure is the signature of a Yeats poem. So often, a Yeats poem could end no other way than the way it ends. If you think of your favorite Yeats poems, I think you'll realize that. A ringing conclusion that is utterly right, no matter how surprising. And interestingly, when Yeats can't finish something, and there are certain plays like The Player Queen, or The Shadowy Waters, which go on and on and on for years and years, or his autobiographical novel, The Speckled Bird, when he can't finish something, it always has a very autobiographical content, that piece of work. So there's something interesting happening there as well. When he does produce his first great public success, it is, again, a poem with an autobiographical charge, and it's a poem significantly written in London, but about emigration, the Lake Isle of Innisfree. I will arise and go now, and go to Innisfree, and a small cabin build there of clay and wattles made. 9 bean rows will I have there, a hive for the honey bee, and live alone in the bee-loud glade. And I shall have some peace there, for peace comes dropping slow, dropping from the vales of the morning to where the cricket sings. There midnight's all a glimmer, and noon a purple glow, and evening full of the linnet's wings. I will arise and go now, for always, night and day, I hear lake water lapping with low sounds by the shore. While I stand on the roadway or on the pavements grey, I hear it in the deep heart's core. Note that ending, which wasn't there in the first version. He wrote about 18 months before then. It ends much more limply. But he ends the poem with those 3 strong beats, the deep heart's core, which I think is something he learned again from Gaelic poetry. It's very much a Gaelic meter. He, not reading Irish, he didn't learn it directly from that, but he learned it from the translations that were being made from Gaelic poetry by people he admired, like Samuel Ferguson. I love that poem. I think it always works. Yeats grew to hate it because he had to recite it so often. Someone spotted him. I think Hugh Kingsmill describes seeing him recite it at some hotel in Switzerland, where he noticed him giving a reading with an air of suppressed loathing. There's also a wonderful letter I found in Kansas from somebody asking permission for Innisfree to be set to music so it could be sung by 4,000 Boy Scouts in the open air. And Yeats has annotated this letter, okay, given the permission, and then he's just written in brackets in the margin, poor island, which I think is lovely. And that personal touch is apposite too, because what he found in that poem was personal utterance, as he called it. He decided his poetry up to then was too cloudy, too directionless. He's only 25, remember. It was too much about the worlds that he imagined and not the worlds he knew. And Innisfree is a turning point because it's concrete, personal utterance, which would be at the center of his poetry, I think, of his best poetry, certainly, from then on. There's a nice little piece of ancillary evidence, too. Again, a letter written long after he died by his sister Lily, who wrote wonderful letters to an adoptive daughter, really, who was a niece in New Zealand. And she suddenly, in the middle of a letter, sometime in the 1940s, which I was reading in a slightly, just in case way, she describes remembering an evening in the house in Bedford Park, and she said, Willie bursting into the room while I was sitting there painting with her friend Helen, and he read to us, or he brought forth, as she puts it, Innisfree. And she just knew that this was greatness, and she could hear the lake water lapping. And then at the end, her friend just looked up and asked if she could borrow a paintbrush. She hadn't listened to a word. And you have this feeling of the wings of history, of literary history anyway, beating over your head, and greatness noticed but also unnoticed. At the same time as personal utterance is discovered in the circles of London Bohemia, Yeats is living at a time of revolution. I've described one kind of revolution, which is the social revolution, the rising Catholic middle classes displacing the kind of privileged people from whom the Yeats family came. Their reaction to this is interesting, because the Yeats family, his immediate family, become nationalists. Now, most of their friends and relations don't, and they see them in a sense as sort of class traitors. But they're strong home rulers, and Yeats will become something more radical than that. He'll become a Fenian, as it's called, revolutionary. He grows up against a background of political change, and he is determined that even though he comes from what has been a unionist, Protestant, upper-middle-class background, he's determined that he will not be marginalized from what's happening to Ireland. Over and over again, he says, in this first half of his life, Ireland is being made, or remade, and those who have the power of imagination must grasp it and must participate in it. And he comes, I must stress again, from a class who are, in a sense, turning their backs on a lot of what's going on. Yeats and a few of his friends are determined to be implicated in what's happening. The slow revolution of the change of landed power, the faster revolution of the shift in political influence, which in the end becomes a real revolution. And he becomes involved in the so-called Fenian movement, secret pledge-bound conspiratorial movement. He's associated with it quite closely for 10 years. And he writes poems in the 1890s, like To Ireland in the Coming Times, which are making a very direct political statement about marginalization. He's saying in a poem like that, look, I can be an Irish Protestant, I can be non-Gaelic, I can be non-Catholic, I can actually believe in the occult, but that can make me a better nationalist than any of you. Know that I would accounted be true brother of that company who sang to sweeten Ireland's wrong, ballad and story, ran and song, nor be I any less of them because the red rose-bordered hem of her whose history began before God made the angelic clan trails all about the written page. For in the world's first blossoming age, the light fall of her flying feet made Ireland's heart begin to beat, and still the starry candles flare to help her light foot here and there, and still the thoughts of Ireland brood upon her holy quietude. And he's saying that he understands Ireland because of his occultist, his spiritualist, his supernatural predilections. He who treads in austere ways may surely meet their ancient gaze. And he is also addressing this poem not only to Ireland in the coming times, but he's addressing it to Maud Gonne, the woman with whom he is in love. I cast my heart into my rhymes, that you in the dim coming times may know how my heart went with them after the red rose-bordered hem. So once again you have a poem doing two jobs. Yeats' poems operate on many levels, and very often poems that one doesn't think of as love poems are love poems. The same, I think, is true of Easter 1916, which I'll come to a little later. And the subject is usually, not always, but usually Maud Gonne. Famously beautiful, fiery, uncompromising nationalist propagandist. Actually English, but becomes more Irish than the Irish. Brought, as he said, the troubling of his life to him. His family, who never liked her, referred to her privately as the infernal Maud. And again, the invaluable Sister's Diary describes when Maud Gonne first came to call on the Yeatses that she kept her slippers on all the time and kept the cab waiting. The Yeatses were poor enough to know that to keep a cab waiting meant that you didn't have financial worries. Yeats was obsessed by her. He tried to win her. Much, I think, of his advanced nationalist political activity was directed towards her. But she was always effortlessly more advanced than he was, and she was, as he later wrote, complete, and I was not. She had also achieved completion early on. She was a woman who did not change her mind, and he writes about this over and over again. He begged her to marry him. She told him she was sworn to a life of dedication to Ireland. In any case, she told him they were astrally related, because in a previous existence they'd been brother and sister, which put a very useful sort of incest block on the procedure. So he wrote her poems instead, which they both referred to as their children, as Lady Gregory would refer to the plays they worked on together as their children. So there's something going on another level here all the time. And the poems he wrote, Maud Gonne, are some of the most famous love poems ever written. The cloths of heaven, always high on the list of all-time favorites. Had I the heavens embroidered cloths enwrought with golden and silver light, the blue and the dim and the dark cloths of night and light and the half-light, I would spread the cloths under your feet, but I, being poor, have only my dreams. I've spread my dreams under your feet. Tread softly, because you tread on my dreams. It was slightly different. She didn't, to put it crudely, fancy Yeats, although they did eventually sleep together, but she was not dedicated solely to Ireland. She had been involved with an older man in France for years. She had had 2 children by him. She didn't believe in marriage. She was a new woman, as they called it then, and a true radical. She had a life of her own, which she didn't reveal to Yeats for 10 years. And he revealed it to him under circumstances of great trauma in 1898. And then, just when he was getting used to this, she turned round and married someone else. A red-headed, utterly unintellectual Irish revolutionary hero who made her very unhappy. They split up. 12 years later, he fought in the 1916 Irish Rising and was executed. Through all of this, their friendship endured, and one of the interesting things in working on Yeats is how women become and remain his friends. Whether or not he has affairs with them, he sustains friendship in a very egalitarian way with a number of strong-minded and interesting and talented women. But Maud Gonne is always at the center of his emotional life. This came, I have to admit, as a slight surprise to me. I had decided when I began all this that there was a certain contrivance about all this. How useful, I thought, if you're a young and poor poet determined on greatness, how useful to fall in love with a dramatically unattainable princesse lointaine who will not marry you, who lives in Paris conveniently a lot of the time, who will not make you go and live in the suburbs and have a day job and 2 children. And I thought that the poems like The White Birds, which are so perfect in the patina of their effect, must come from a calculation as well as a passion. But reading his unpublished work, reading his drafts, his horoscope calculations, his accounts of dreams, which he kept endlessly, even long before he began reading Jung, whom he read very early, he was recording all his dreams. You just have to recognize a major obsession. And it's perhaps most clearly portrayed not in what I've called the gleaming surface, the patina of his famous love poems, but really in his drafts, in his scribbles, in a prose idea for a poem called Subject for Lyric, which is in one of his notebooks, where he writes of her coming to sit in his room by the railway station, by Euston railway station, on her way to France, taking off her hat, rearranging her hair in the mirror, and he says, "You play with me with images of marriage, which you will not give me." And it's a very, it's a thing anyone could have felt. It's not about white birds and spreading cloths of heaven under his beloved's feet. It's a real cry from the heart. It's more ordinary and therefore, I think, more moving. And to work through Yeats's drafts, because he begins often with an ordinary idea and then builds it up in his notebooks with imagery often culled from ideas or notes he's made years before into one of the astonishing combinations which his best poetry is. Gonne keeps recurring because there's another bond between them which reflects on something. Carl mentioned Auden's comments on Yeats. Auden was always very clever about Yeats, sometimes rather bitchy, but always very clever. I treasure a limerick, just comes into mind, though it's not relevant to what I'm about to say, of Auden's on Yeats, which is something like, "To get the late poems of Yeats, you need not mug up any dates. All the reader requires is some knowledge of gyres and the kind of people he hates," which is actually a very good guide to late Yeats. But he also, Auden wrote off Yeats's occult supernatural interests. He called it the South Californian side of Yeats. And this was a fashionable thing to do 20 or 30 years ago. It was foolish and silly, and you just tried to ignore it for embarrassment's sake and get on with it. You can't do that because it's one of the central bulwarks of Yeats's spiritual, imaginative, and I would argue emotional life. He believed in the occult world. He spent his life trying to find arcane truths through the study of magic. He joined orders of mystical initiates. He spent a large amount of money and time chasing up ghosts of one kind or another, traveling to seances, seeking out spiritualists, investigating occult phenomena. Why? Maud Gonne is one reason. She too was a convinced believer, and he made this an area where he could, if not control her, at least be her guide. They wanted to form a secret mystical Celtic order together, a sort of order of poets and visionaries which would, I think, replace religion. They prospected around Ireland for a place where this secret order would begin. Yeats rather pathetically writes to her that he hopes it can be done for 30 shillings a week. Maud didn't have to worry about money in the same way he did. They exchange visions when they're apart. They try and have simultaneous dreams, which have a very sexual content, metaphorically speaking. The language of these is straight Freudianism, really. They're inspired partly chemically, because they take mescaline and hashish together, but partly also from a wide variety of reading in the Kabbalah and the wisdom of the Tarot and all those other things that were very fashionable in the 1880s and 90s, as they are once again very fashionable. Remember, Yeats is an 1890s decadent, but he's also an art student in the 1880s, and some things never change, art students among them. But he can use the occult senses to bring his influence to bear on people, to dominate clubs and circles, even to educate himself. I see it as a kind of do-it-yourself university, complete with reading lists, degrees that you pass through, lectures, quarrels that make university department quarrels look mild, factions, and all the time the idea that you're proceeding through levels of knowledge to a qualification which will give you authority. And that is why I've called my first volume The Apprentice Mage, because I think he is determined to learn how to be a magician. I've also, as an historian, looked in this in a slightly different way, and I found, I think, a long tradition of marginalized Irish Protestant figures who are interested in the occult, going back to Charles Maturin, who wrote Melmoth the Wanderer, Sheridan Le Fanu, who invented lesbian vampires, and even Bram Stoker, who comes from exactly the same background as Yeats, declining Irish clerical Protestant bourgeoisie. I could talk a little more about Dracula as an absentee Irish landlord if you like, but I won't. I do think that Yeats uses his belief in the occult and in fairy lore to demonstrate a claim on Ireland, to claim the land of Ireland. Again, to say, look, I may come from a tradition that the nationalist vogue writes off as being un-Irish, but actually through my links, through my knowledge, through my identification of Ireland's occult, supernatural otherworld, I am more Irish than any of you. This, of course, was unpopular with conventional Irish opinion, and he spent his life being criticized for it, notably by Catholic clerics. And he takes up a confrontational and public stance, especially when in his theatre, the Abbey Theatre, he begins, or, well, from the very beginning, he is trying to put on drama which will express some of these themes. And it's not coincidental, again, that Yeats adopts his confrontational approach to the Irish theatre and to the kind of plays he wants to put on when Maud Gonne has married someone else, when they've drifted apart a little, when he is becoming disillusioned, I'm talking about 1902, 1903, with conventional Irish nationalism. And he decides that the theatre will be like a sort of secret society where the artist will officiate like a kind of priest, presenting avant-garde and inspirational art to an audience who will be united by it. His favorite quotation about this is, in fact, comes from Victor Hugo: in the theatre, a mob becomes a people. By concentrating on a visionary presentation, people are welded together. And this, of course, has very strong national and nationalist implications. Wagner is thinking in a not dissimilar way at this very time. It didn't work out quite like that, and Yeats was constantly embattled within and without, because what he wanted to put on stage in the Abbey Theatre was considered by conventional Irish nationalism, notably by the new Sinn Féin movement from 1904-5, was considered not really acceptable. The theatre, of course, did become famous. It was the crucible for talents like J.M. Synge and Sean O'Casey, but it didn't put on work, at least Yeats didn't want to put on work, that would fit the pious image of nationalist Ireland as conceived by Sinn Féin. And one reason why he loved and defended Synge's plays, notably The Playboy of the Western World, was because it subverted piety. And his beautiful poem, The Fisherman, which is about an ideal Irish audience, is, I think, an elegy for Synge, as well as an attack on his Irish enemies. I think it's very likable in Yeats to be so in favor of Synge, who is a great playwright, because Yeats's own plays sent people away from the theatre in droves. the very few exceptions always have something special about them. One is his nationalist, really allegory play, Kathleen na Houlihan, which he wrote with Lady Gregory, which Lady Gregory in her diary says, which I wrote all but all of, but which was put out under Yeats's more famous name, in which Maud Gonne acted mesmerically and people went wild about it. It's interesting that Lady Gregory is involved in this. She's a fascinating character who becomes, in fact, more Republican than Yeats, more nationalist than Yeats, I think, as time goes on. And she's the other great female relationship in his life besides Maud Gonne. Some people have spoken of her as a surrogate parent figure to him, but I don't think that's right. She's remembered inaccurately as a sort of Queen Victoria figure, little and dumpy and dressed in black and a kind of professional widow. Actually, she wasn't at all like that. She had several affairs with younger men. She was a powerful and interesting and interventionist character. She was determined, as Yeats was, to become an artist, and did. And she, through willpower, because she had very little money, she did turn her home, Coole Park, into a salon for some of the most interesting writers of the Renaissance, and she devoted her great energies and talents to the Abbey Theatre and kept it going when Yeats alone could not have done so. And his relationship with Lady Gregory, whom he meets at a very low point in his life in the 1890s, is very interesting because he writes to her about everything in his life, but he puts a spin on it that, as we all do, that he thinks his recipient will most react to. And he writes to her in the persona, I think, of the kind of person he thinks she wants him to be. And over the, 40-odd years of their relationship, he becomes something like the kind of person he thinks she wants him to be. It's a very Jamesian sort of procedure. And she gives him a lot, but he gives her a lot. And one of the things he gives her is a great poetic gift, which are the elegies he writes for her beloved only son, Robert, who is killed in the First World War. And again, one of these poems that seems simple, but must be put in context for its true complexity and cleverness and almost deviousness to be spotted. An Irish airman foresees his death. I know that I shall meet my fate somewhere among the clouds above. Those that I fight I do not hate, those that I guard I do not love. My country is Kiltartan Cross, my countrymen Kiltartan's poor. No likely end could bring them loss or leave them happier than before. Nor law nor duty bade me fight, nor public men nor cheering crowds. A lonely impulse of delight drove to this tumult in the clouds. I balanced all, brought all to mind. The years to come seemed waste of breath, a waste of breath, the years behind, in balance with this life, this death. Which sounds a very nihilistic and rather amoral view of why you go off and fight and kill people. But you must remember it's 1918. The Easter Rising has happened 2 years before. People who were fighting for Britain were not looked on kindly by nationalist Ireland in 1918. What this poem is saying, besides establishing Gregory as a figure of sprezzatura and almost offhand nihilism in a way, besides doing that, which is utterly inaccurate, because Robert Gregory was actually very imperially minded and fought, I think, with an absolute sense of who he was fighting for. Besides doing that, it's saying it's okay for him to have been killed fighting for Britain because he didn't really mean it. He was doing it in this offhand way. He knew exactly that he was Irish, that his identifications went to the village at the gates of his mother's house, and that's why he did it, so he can be mourned as a true Irishman, not as a soldier in the service of the evil empire. So there's again a very clever political twist to be decoded there. By then, of course, Yeats himself is a fairly hardline nationalist in the years after 1916, but this has required some reinsertion of himself back into the tradition of Irish nationalism, because in fact what his writing up to certainly 1914-15 is remarkable for is a disillusionment, an estrangement, as he called it, from Irish nationalism. And I think a thing biographers sometimes do is to try and choose, or they find themselves choosing, a piece of work by their subject which acts as a pivot for a whole change in consciousness. Ellman does this wonderfully with Joyce's short story, The Dead, which he takes as an absolute explication, really, of a catharsis in Joyce's life. If I've done anything like that in the volume that I've completed, it's with an essay called J.M. Synge and the Ireland of His Time, which Yeats wrote technically as an elegy in memory of Synge in 1910, but really as an explanation for why he, Yeats, had to separate from conventional Irish nationalism, which he says now is forbidding intellectual experiment. And the key moment when this happened was when Sinn Féin got the audiences to riot against Synge's great play, The Playboy of the Western World. And when Yeats, as he says, stood there watching, knowing that I saw the dissolution of a school of patriotism that held sway over my youth. And he goes on to construct an argument in this 1910 essay which is against the pressures of national conformity, which is to say Ireland is now culturally independent enough not to need the, as he calls them, images for the affections, not to need the confining stereotypes of old-style nationalism. He said we must now be a modern country, and that means experiment in art and allowing experiment in art. We now, he said, have the world's ear, thanks implicitly to the work of himself and his generation. And it's an essay, an autobiography, masquerading, I think, as an elegy for his dead friend. But between 1913 and 1916, as Irish politics become revolutionized, as World War I comes along, as revolutionary conspiracy gathers, there's a failed rising revolution in 1916, a draconian British reaction, and opinion shifts. The people who've made the revolution are, in fact, the generation whom Yeats has been quarreling with, the Sinn Féiners who criticize his work, who have attacked Synge's plays. They include people like Maud Gonne's estranged husband, John MacBride. But when Yeats decides to memorialize the 1916 rising in his, I think, great poem, Easter 1916, he does so by memorializing these very people and by reinserting himself and his generation of cultural experimenters in the 90s into the process of Irish political revolution, which isn't quite right. He'd become marginalized from all this years before 1916, but by arguing, as he does incessantly from then to the end of his life, that the cultural revolution he put into gear after Parnell's death in 1891 produced the 1916 rising. He has made himself a political founding father. You can follow the procedure in his letters after he hears of the 1916 rising, and as he changes his mind about its significance, and he changes his preoccupations. And the result is one of his great poems, Easter 1916, which immortalizes the refrain, all is changed utterly, a terrible beauty is born. He apostrophizes the heroes of the revolution, but there's a central ambiguity in it. And interestingly, it's the same ambiguity that is in his great Synge essay of 1910. And if you read the notes for that Synge essay, you find the images, notably of a stone fixed in the stream of life, which he will use in the Easter 1916 poem. It owes as much to his thoughts in 1910 as to his reactions in 1916. And after apostrophizing the heroism of the revolutionary generation after his own, he writes, "Hearts with one purpose alone through summer and winter seem enchanted to a stone to trouble the living stream. The horse that comes from the road, the rider, the birds that range from cloud to tumbling cloud. Minute by minute they change, a shadow of cloud on the stream changes minute by minute. A horse hoof slides on the brim and a horse plashes within it. The long-legged moorhens dive and hens to moorcocks call. Minute by minute they live, the stones in the midst of all. Too long a sacrifice can make a stone of the heart. Oh, when may it suffice?" And that goes right back to that Synge essay where he had prophetically said that minds whose patriotism was great enough to carry them to the scaffold cry down natural impulse with the morbid persistence of minds unsettled by some fixed idea. And he'd gone on to write that a generation was becoming like a hysterical woman who makes unmeasured accusations and believes impossible things because of a logical deduction which has turned a portion of her mind to stone. No prizes for saying, guessing who he was thinking of. So in a sense, Easter 1916 is a love poem to Maud Gonne. And it makes further sense to know that he wrote, well, he finished it, staying with her in her house in France. He stayed up all one night to finish it. He read it to her standing on the beach the next morning during their walk. He asked her to marry him. Again, the composition of this poem is as built up with that great recurring relationship as it is with the political events it purports to describe. And the stanza I read about the flux of life, the stony heart at the centre of it, the mating of moorcocks and moorhens going on around this beautiful image of a horse splashing through a stream, is about his attempt to make her join him in a more normal, conventional married relationship. As usual, he failed to please her. She didn't like the poem. She sent him a long and rather marvellous letter beginning, "No, Willie, I do not like your poem," in which she denied, as a good Catholic, that sacrifice had ever turned anything to stone. But there she is again, in a poem which doesn't seem to be about her. As for him, he's back with advanced nationalism again. He writes famous poems and less famous plays, pressing the nationalist cause. He becomes, as I've said at the beginning of this lecture, a famous public figure in a newly independent Ireland. He speaks out on issues of civil, religious liberty, but he always fights with established authority. And in conclusion, I'll anticipate a little my next volume, because what happens by the early 1930s is that he is so disillusioned that he has a fling with right-wing politics, and I think this feeds directly into the way he writes, because in the last decade of his life, in the 1930s, he writes more and more originally and more angrily, and he rails against old age, loss of sexual potency, which he tries to reverse by a slightly crazy operation, as well as several love affairs, and he becomes a great and controversial Irish institution. His last poems were thought by many to be incomprehensible, but they now seem his greatest. And poems like Long-Legged Fly seem to anticipate the threat to civilization which is coming, to anticipate more eloquently than ever. And what this poem, written in his late period, shows, I think, is how he can move across centuries of history and art and mythology with a brilliant economy, from the Roman Empire to Helen of Troy to the Sistine Chapel. And I think it's the mark of the autodidact, the self-taught, poverty-stricken art student in Hammersmith, as well as of the genius, that he's unafraid to tackle these great, almost too obvious instances of cultural history. They also demonstrate, I think, that Jungian interest in archetypes, which never left him. That civilization may not sink, its great battle lost. Quiet the dog, tether the pony to a distant post. Our master Caesar is in his tent, where the maps are spread, his eyes fixed upon nothing, a hand under his head. Like a long-legged fly upon the stream, his mind moves upon silence. That the topless towers be burnt, and men recall that face. Move most gently, if move you must, in this lonely place. She thinks, part woman, 3 parts a child, that nobody looks. Her feet practice a tinker shuffle, picked up on a street. Like a long-legged fly upon the stream, her mind moves upon silence. That girls at puberty may find the first Adam in their thought. Shut the door of the Pope's chapel, keep those children out. There on that scaffolding reclines Michelangelo. With no more sound than the mice make, his hand moves to and fro. Like a long-legged fly upon the stream, his mind moves upon silence. Yeats dies in 1939 in the south of France, controversial even in death, and there's one wonderful obituary by an old friend and a sparring partner, Stephen Gwynne, who always said he didn't like Yeats, but had to write about him. And Gwynne's obituary, which hasn't, I think, been quoted before, or since it was written, went, first and last he was smashing idols in the marketplace. At first, the cheap rhetoric of drum-beating ballads, false models and poetry. Later, justifying work which his artistic sense approved as vital, while the crowd denounced it as an insult to Ireland. First and last, he was a champion of freedom, but above all, against the tyrannies of democracy. And in the end, the democracy, which he never spared to resist and rebuke, marches to its credit behind his coffin. Yeats, of course, had to have the last word, so he wrote his own obituary in a poem called Under Ben Bulben. And it's rather different from that tone. Many times man lives and dies between his two eternities, that of race and that of soul, and ancient Ireland knew it all. Whether man dies in his bed or the rifle knocks him dead, a brief parting from those dear is the worst man has to fear. Though gravediggers' toil is long, sharp their spades, their muscles strong, they but thrust their buried men back in the human mind again. In this, as in all his life, autobiography is being threaded through, and his occult, his ideas, his beliefs are there in that simple ballad meter. As you all know, you can't bank on the I, the personal voice in any poem, being that of the poet. It's one of the great misleading devices of poets who are ventriloquists. But with Yeats, the I is often a personal I. And you may have noticed how many of the poems I've read begin with the word I. A poet, he said, writes out of his personal life always, which is why it's important to study his biography, another sanction. And from my point of view, why it's important to write it on a scale which hasn't been attempted before. At the same time, his imagination is fabulous, as James Joyce said. Joyce said no one could equal, no surrealist poet could equal Yeats's imagination. His occult studies, his strange reading provide those astonishing images in a poem, let's say like Sailing to Byzantium, images that range from a mackerel-crowded sea to a bird of hammered gold singing on a tree. And this kind of imagery can lead you astray. He's trying to construct a pattern, he's trying to dazzle you. Even when he puts a date at the end of a poem, it might not be the date the poem was written. This was a horror to me when I slowly realized it. But essentially, it all goes back into his astonishing life. Love, sex, politics, occultism. And he tells us this in one of those great last poems, the last one I'll read part of, The Circus Animal's Desertion, where he describes the themes that have preoccupied him. And he ends, those masterful images, because complete, grew in pure mind, but out of what began? A mound of refuse, or the sweepings of a street, old kettles, old bottles, and a broken can, old iron, old bones, old rags, that raving slut who keeps the till. Now that my ladder's gone, I must lie down where all the ladders start, in the foul rag and bone shop of the heart. And his genius, his inspiration, are here seen as a ladder to ascend from the everyday circumstances of life. Eliot, in fact, to return to him in conclusion, admitted as much. When he said that you couldn't understand Yeats's times, as I've said, without reading his poetry, and couldn't equally understand Yeats's poetry unless you knew a bit about the history against which he wrote his poems. And that goes for public general history as well as personal history. In fact, I think it's one of the reasons why his poetry not only lives but grows in stature. Doing justice to it involves understanding the full historical complexity of Yeats's life, and such an understanding, such tracing the lineaments, as Yeats put it, as it happens, does justice to Ireland's complex history as well. Thank you. Thank you. If there are questions, I'm happy to take some. Yes.
I was wondering about the plays. Why were they not done?
They're hard to do because the early ones are hard to do because he dreamt of enormous scenic effects. There's a wonderful correspondence with Gordon Craig, the great experimenter of the sort of fantasy-active period. And Yeats wanted effects that nowadays you probably could do actually with lighting and scene changes, but which were very hard to do in his own day. And it's only late in his life, I was talking about this with Carl actually, exactly the subject before I lectured, that it's only late in his life he gets it right, I think, in short economical plays like The Words Upon the Window Pane and Purgatory, both of which have actually been revived very recently in London and quite successfully. They're also more accessibly written. I think the kind of occult charge of the earlier Cuchulainn plays and the slightly creaky political symbolism of some of them, like The King's Threshold, which is about censorship and the place of the artist, while you could see them being updated rather relevantly in certain societies, look a bit a bit irrelevant now. I keep waiting for somebody to start reinterpreting them, and they had the whole Cuchulainn play cycle has been done in Dublin by directed by James Flannery from Atlanta, in fact, for the last 3 years. But I have to say, I don't think they've been an unqualified success. Yeah.
This is sort of two parts. How's central? So we can hear you. Oh, what? How central to Yeats' greatness is Maud Gonne, and what did marriage provide for him?
Well, I've been asked how central to Yeats' life Maud Gonne was and what marriage provided for him. And I've tried in a way to show she is very central to his imagination and to his emotional being. And in a way she's central both in giving him a great image to live for and a great ideal to follow. But she's also central in, I'm sure unintentionally, making him confront what he conceives of as his own inadequacies. Because when she does, for instance, marry an unintellectual man of action, I think he feels very wrong-footed. And his whole public stance, especially, he goes to America, interestingly, for the first time just after this bombshell bursts on him, and his whole quarrelsome, public, aggressive, hyper-masculine stance in America, I think, owes a great deal to the shock she's just dealt him. As to marriage, he married a woman much younger than he, who shared his occult interests, who was, like all his women friends, extremely strong-minded, intelligent, and independent, which was as well for her. And she provided him with a home with some money, because she had a private income. She guarded his health. She also allowed him his freedom, which was very important, and she was no mean critic. I've seen letters of hers, in fact, very recently in Yale, where she writes to a friend of hers about the poetry he's writing in the late 20s, and she says, some of it I think very remarkable, some of it, it's some word, is it rubbish? She uses some terribly dismissive word. I was shocked. And then I thought, well, she may not have been altogether wrong at that point, because he was writing very freely and very garrulously at that time, too. So she also brought, I think, a fine critical edge, and she kept the Yeats estate, the literary estate, really in, well, scholars complained about the chaotic state of the archives in the 50s and 60s, but that didn't matter. The point was she kept the stuff. When he threw out stuff, she kept it. She did keep it, I think, fairly well in order, and she knew the importance of her editorial task. Sorry, there is another question.
You mentioned the difficulty of Yeats misdating his poems. I wonder if you could talk about what some of the other most difficult challenges of writing Yeats's life have been.
The handwriting was the first one, which, because he had terribly bad eyesight and was nearly blind at certain points in his life, so his handwriting is frightful. And he begins dictating letters quite early on, and that puts a filter between what he's saying and thinking, I think, and what's appearing on the page, because, he's dictating something to a typist in a room near the British Museum, and he's certainly not going to wear his heart on his sleeve. In that, it also means he writes these endless letters, because they're dictated. So you have to look at a Yeats letter very carefully to see how it was made and what it's doing, and very often the most important stuff will be a scribbled postscript at the end, which was too confidential for the typist. So the decoding of Yeats' documents presents all sorts of special difficulties, though they are difficulties historians are trained to cope with. The methods of composition, which I had hoped not to have to worry too much about because of the great corpus of literary criticism, are something I do have to worry about, because I did realize, as I said in the lecture, that his notes for poems often are as biographically important as what he eventually ends up saying on the printed page. So to reassemble the various drafts of something, I'm very interested in the play The Player Queen, for instance. It isn't a very good play, but it's one of those things he took a very long time writing and redrafting, and I think grows out of certain relationships he had in the theatre, notably with a woman called Mabel Dickinson, who he had a love affair with for about 4 years, from 1909. So I'm forever finding another damnable draft of The Player Queen that I didn't know existed, and trying to find out or decide at what point he made those changes. Something is true in the same way of a much better play, The Countess Kathleen, which he begins before he meets Maud Gonne, but which he then in various drafts turns into, I think, a Maud Gonne play, and Maud Gonne becomes, I think, the Countess, and the figure of this bard, minstrel, lover, or person in love with the Countess becomes more and more important, and of course this is Yeats, and that relationship begins to take central place in the play, which originally was about something else altogether. So one of the difficulties is having to learn the tools, if you like, of textual criticism to turn them to a biographer's use. But the more you do it, the more addictive it gets. The main, just to end this answer, the main problem is the sheer weight and volume of material all over the world, and the difficulty of physically reading some. Yes?
I just wondered if, talking about Yeats and theater, if you come through so much material, have you ever read and or seen a theater piece about Yeats? And also, if you could go back in time and see Yeats the performer live, what would you want to see him do? I mean, I'm sure you come through someone like a speech or a lecture or something that you thought, I wish I could be there and see him do that.
I think I'd like to have seen him take on the Abbey audiences, rioting or complaining or demonstrating against an O'Casey or a Synge play, and I'd like to have heard him address them from the stage. Because I've listened to all those recordings and reading the poetry, and sometimes it's wonderful and sometimes it isn't, because he has this strange ear, utterly unmusical, couldn't learn foreign languages, composed out loud in order to get a rhythm, and he reads them in this very stagey way, which often loses, I think, the inner assonance of the line. Plays about Yeats, it's an interesting question. I think one of Yeats's best plays is, as I said, The Words from the Window Pane, which is a play about Swift, and of Swift coming through a medium's voice. And if somebody wrote a play like that about Yeats, it would indeed be very interesting. But he's not terribly easy to dramatize.
I'm surprised there's just, I mean, you have things about Wilde and,
yeah,
people of that time.
It will be done. I mean, I know that someone has the option on a film about Maud Gonne's life, for instance, in which he was obviously a figure. There's a question just in front there.
Yes, could you explain more about the image or the metaphor of the winding staircase as a kind of symbol for human progress, and does Yeats made any allowance for those of us who seem to be going down the staircase rather than up?
I can't really be very profound about this. I think the notion of a tower and a stair going up it is something that he's had from very early on. He has it when he has a sort of vision of Ariosto when he's in Italy. He's walking along a road, and this is 1907, in the twilight, and he sees a tower with an outside staircase going up to it, and he has a terrifically powerful vision of a poet's place being up at the top of that tower, having ascended the staircase, looking out the window. And this, of course, predicts by 21 years, his great volume of verse, The Tower, which is based for its central image on his own tower that he bought near Lady Gregory's medieval castle with a staircase up it. The winding of the stair is obviously associated with the idea of gyres, of spirals, of interconnecting spirals. And I suppose the notion of a spiral is that you're ascending, but you can't see what's ahead of you, you can't see what's around the corner. I think that the idea of development, but being necessarily in ignorance of what remains at the end of it, of what's around just the next corner, is something he recurs to time and time again. Never more epigrammatically than in a very late letter where he says, man can embody truth but not know it. And I think that idea of being unable to see what's directly ahead is to do with the spiral movement. But I'm just moving on to the period of his life where he writes A Vision, which of course is all about these kind of ideas, so I'll answer that question a little better in about 6 months' time. Yes?
I was very interested in the reversion in April 1916 support for the people that in a way he had set in motion earlier, but since distanced himself from a kind of a grandfathering of himself, and grandfathering also before this word came to be used in New York real estate. But, you know, like Seamus Heaney's late writing about the Troubles, or, I mean, is there an echo or a pre-echo, post-echo now of art for art's sake versus PC that we see in so many artists? I mean, the argument now in New York is it's very hard not to have some PC content in art. Yeats, in a way, sort of, is it relevant, this moment of Yeats, relevant to our own?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure that I put it in PC terms. I'd put it in terms, if PC stands for political commitment, perhaps. I know it doesn't, but I mean, that's, I would take it as that, and I would say that Yeats, like all Irish artists, operates against a highly politicized background. Like all Irish artists, and Heaney himself has said this, you're trying to balance the claims that an audience which is, you know, embroiled in politics makes upon you, and the necessary independence which an artist has to try and work from. Yeats's, astonishing to me, achievement is that his political poems, no matter how political, remain somehow, in a way, above politics, too. Partly because of what I was saying earlier about the two levels, the at least two levels that they always work on. On the one hand, you'll get a simple, or not simple, but a lyric like Wandering Angus, which you think isn't about politics. I think, in a sense, it is. On the other hand, you'll get very direct Fenian political poems like the Rose Tree poems, which are also, I think, about occult and supernatural imagery, as well as being about sacrificial revolutionary politics. And in a sense, he is providing, by observing those two functions, he's providing you with an alternative level on which to decode or respond to a poem if the direct politics of it don't particularly appeal to you. Easter 1916 does this, I think, more complexly almost than any other poem he writes, which is one reason why I find it very fascinating. Seamus Heaney's way of handling Irish politics, I always remember when I read North for the first time, must have been in the early 1970s, and it had surprised me that people weren't writing, as they weren't, incredible it may seem, much about Northern Irish politics then. And when I read North, those wonderful images of the bog and history and all the rest of it, I thought, so this is how it can be written about. I remember thinking that. Heaney's, I think his great recent collection, well, it's not that recent now, it's Station Island, has political poems in it as well, which very interestingly mix the supernatural with the political. There's that long poem of visions of people, begins with William Carleton, and then a relative of his who was shot appears as a ghost to him. And it's again doing this highly devious and highly intelligent thing of writing a political poem while leaving a latitude for interpretation which doesn't box the poet into being the voice of one faction or the other, while you know the tradition from which he writes. Sorry, it's rather a complex answer, but I think it's a very interesting question. It's a good question.
Yeah, it's sort of a two-part question. First part, did he ever acknowledge his English heritage or background, and did he write in any kind of romanticized form about the descendancy of the English landed class in Ireland? That's the first part. And the second part is, can you talk a little bit about the term Celtic twilight? Because when I first heard about it, I thought of twilight as being kind of the end of something, but perhaps the term twilight is used in a different way.
Well, you're absolutely right. I'll answer the second question first, which is the meaning of Celtic twilight. Yeats makes it very specific, and so does George Russell, A.E., who was one of his great friends and who also a great figure in the Celtic revival. They made it very clear that for them twilight was the hour before the dawn, which had all sorts of occult suggestiveness. And twilight meant a pre-dawn thing, not the fading off of something. But because we so generally use twilight as meaning the end of the day, that's what it's assumed to be. But actually they were concerned to emphasize that it was that witching hour just before the sun rises. And in fact, A.E. has painted a painting called The Celtic Twilight, which is currently on exhibit in Yale at the British Arts Centre. I saw it there the other day, which is two people bending over a well out of which this blaze of light is coming. And I think it's meant to represent the well of Conla, which is an idea in Irish mythology of a well where everlasting life and wisdom comes from. And the sky above them is raining down light as well, and it's obviously the dawn is about to rise. And it's called The Celtic Twilight, so that's a very concrete example of it. The other question you ask about Yeats's recognition of his English inheritance, that's on two levels. He is always very conscious of, and is much criticized by Irish nationalists for this, he's very conscious of the importance to him and to any other, he would have said, educated person of the great tradition of English literature. He has been educated and grown up in the English language, whether that was desirable or not, it is how he is. He thinks that the Irish have put a special twist and value and valency and flexibility into their writing in the English language, which is a great achievement. He says he owes his soul to Spenser and William Morris and Shakespeare and Milton and Byron and Shelley, you know, the whole grand tradition, and deliberately, I think, mentioning Spenser, whom he adores, but who, of course, was a planter in Ireland and a brutal one, and wrote texts for the British government in the 16th century suggesting very brutal measures against Irish natives. Yeats can separate that from Spenser's astonishing and to him very inspirational poetic voice. But at the same time, he says in a marvelous piece of writing that was published posthumously called A General Introduction to My Work, he says that though he owes his soul to this great tradition, at the same time in everyday political circumstances and in the kind of Fenian politics in which he's been involved, he is, of course, on some levels anti-English, and my love tortures me with hate, my hate with love, he says. But at the same time, he spends an awful lot of time in England. Many of his best friends, most of his lovers, his wife, indeed, are all English. And his descent is another matter. His family have been in Ireland for 300 or 400 years. You know, they go back a long way, and some of them to French roots rather than English. So he's not at all a recent English import. He wouldn't use the word Anglo-Irish of his family, nor should it be thus used. You know, they've been rooted there a long time, but their origins go back to settlements in the 17th century in some cases, but right back to the 12th century in the case of the Butlers, to whom he is also related. And he's very conscious of that tradition. And he, in a sense, rediscovers it in the 1920s when he's a senator in the Free State, when he becomes disillusioned with the way Irish politics seem to be going, with the ascendancy of people whom he thinks are uncultured. And he begins very aggressively expounding the virtues and the values of the ascendancy tradition of Burke, of Grattan, of the great 18th century figures in Irish life. This is not a popular line to pursue in the late 1920s, but that's all the more attractive to him. Whenever he's, just finally, a way in which he's very good, it's the same trick he does in his poetry of politics, working on another level as well. Even when he makes a political speech on a very, we'll say, PC Irish nationalist line, like that Home Rule must come, he will give a reason for it, which is so offensive to his audience that you can tell it's given him certain pleasure. The one I'm thinking of is a speech actually in America where he says we must have home rule in Ireland, we must have political autonomy because it will educate Catholics mentally and Protestants emotionally. So he's, I think it's a wonderful right and left there, which he's very good at.
Maybe one more question and then we should adjourn.
Okay, is there one more?
Here?
Oh, yes.
How did Yeats associate his right-wing politics of the 30s with some pretty unsavory sympathizers, either in Ireland or in Europe? He's not your standard fascist, in other words.
No, he's not. He's quite keen on Mussolini. He spends a lot of time in Italy in the 1920s, staying with Ezra Pound, which isn't exactly a good connection. He actually goes to Italy in the mid-30s as a guest of the government, in fact. He doesn't like what's happening in Germany, but he won't put his name to public objections to it. He is pretty in favor of authoritarian politics and pretty against what he thinks democratic politics produce. But when he does have his fling with the Irish right-wing movement, the Blue Shirts, who aren't really fascists in that sense, but are an authoritarian old army group who want to well, put the clock back, essentially, in terms of Irish politics. It's a short-lived fling. He thinks these are much cleverer people than they are, fundamentally. And he gets deeply disillusioned when he finds that they're not reading Nietzsche and ready to discuss Wagner's notion of the position of the artist in modern politics. So he then, quite elegantly, disconnects himself. His wife also, to her credit, is very against all this, and I think her influence here, as always, is important. It should also be said that though some of his late poems have a disturbing eugenicist twist, and he's interested in eugenics, as many people are in the 1920s and 30s, he is never anti-Semitic, rather the opposite. And I think some of that goes back to his great commitment to studies in the Kabbalah and his belief in the wisdom of Jewish mysticism, which he becomes very interested in the 1890s. So I think I can see him being sympathetic to Mussolini, but I don't think he was ever sympathetic to Hitler or to Nazism as such. At the same time, it would be dishonest to say, not to admit, that he approved of authoritarian politics and thought that democracy hadn't delivered all it should. But always remember he died early in 1939. You know, he didn't live to see what was about to happen. And he also, I have found rather interesting speeches, again, in America, where he speaks quite clearly of his views on democracy, but it seems to me that he's denouncing democracy in artistic, in cultural matters, and at the same time saying that it can be a political good, but that elitism must rule in art, which is not such an unusual, or perhaps not such a disturbing thing to say. Thank you very much.
Oswego is offering a seminar on the poems of William Butler Yeats from July 6th to July 31st. Anyone who's interested should see me.
In a moment, we'll hear about the history and operations of the Book of the Month Club from Editor-in-Chief Greg Tobin. And in 20 minutes, David Darlington discusses his book about a military research installation in Nevada known as Area 51. If you'd like to order a video copy of an About Books program,